I thought the best parts of my life were behind me. I spent years feeling invisible until one abandoned park reminded me that growth can begin anywhere. This is the story of how saving a broken place ended up saving me, too. My name is Margaret, and I am 65 years old. And for most of the past few years, I have lived inside a quiet that often felt heavier than the walls around me. I would wake up in the early morning and sit at the edge of my bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the soft ticking of the old clock on the hallway wall, as if those tiny sounds were the only things reminding me that time was still moving. My days were slow and predictable, and I tried to tell myself that routine brought comfort, but the truth was that I missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway and the warmth of a voice calling my name. I could walk through my entire house without hearing a single human sound, and that kind of silence does not stay on the outside. It begins to seep into your chest in a way that makes breathing feel like remembering something you almost forgot. I would stand by the living room window with a cup of tea cooling in my hands and look at the park across the street. It used to be a bright place, filled with laughter and the rolling chatter of children chasing each other across the grass. But over time, it became a tired shape of what it once was. The benches were worn, the pathways cracked, and the swings creaked in the wind as if they carried memories of voices that had stopped visiting. Sometimes a single person would pass through, but even they walked quickly, as if the empty space made them uncomfortable. I would stare at the abandoned flower beds and feel a strange reflection of myself in them, a sense that something meant to be alive had slowly stopped being cared for. The loneliness I felt was not dramatic or loud. It was the kind that settles in quietly, like dust gathering on a shelf. But one morning, when the sun was stretching itself across the sky in a soft gold, and my house felt especially hollow, my eyes drifted once again to the park. A thought rose inside me so gently that I almost ignored it. I wondered what would happen if I tried to bring life back to that forgotten place. I wondered if helping something outside myself might pull me out of the stillness I had let grow in my own heart. I stood there holding my cooling tea and felt a small spark of something that I had not felt in a while. It was not excitement, and it was not confidence. It was a kind of quiet determination, the kind that whispers rather than shouts. I walked outside and crossed the street with no real plan, just an urge to be somewhere that did not echo the same quiet my home held. The grass crunched under my shoes, and the air smelled faintly of earth that had not been disturbed in a long time. When I knelt down near the abandoned flower bed, the soil felt dry and tired. I traced my fingers across it and felt something like recognition, as if both of us had been waiting for someone to care enough to start again. I told myself that I would come back the next day and maybe pull a few weeds or pick up some of the scattered trash. It felt like a small goal, but small goals are often what pull us forward when we have been standing still for too long. I spent the rest of that day inside my house, feeling a strange shift in the air around me. It was as if the decision to step outside myself for just a moment had opened a door I did not realize had been closed. I made a list of things I might need for the park and found my old gardening gloves tucked away in a drawer. They were worn but familiar, and when I held them, I felt a soft memory of who I used to be, someone who created things, someone who brought life into places. That night, as I lay in bed, listening again to the ticking of the hallway clock, I felt the loneliness still sitting beside me, but it no longer felt like the only thing in the room. It felt as if something new had sat down quietly beside it, something patient and hopeful. I realized that maybe I could not change the past that had brought me here, but I could shape something with my hands and my heart. And maybe, just maybe, shaping something outside myself would help reshape something inside me too. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, long before the light had fully formed outside my curtains, and there was a quiet restlessness inside me that felt different from the loneliness I had grown used to. It pushed me out of bed with a gentle insistence, as if some part of me already knew that today mattered more than the days before it. I made tea and stood again by the window, watching the empty park as the sun slowly revealed it inch by inch. The place still looked neglected, but now that I had stepped into it once, it no longer felt separate from me. It felt like a responsibility I had chosen with my own hands. I carried a small bag of tools across the street, feeling almost shy as I entered the park, even though no one was there to see me. The morning air was crisp and smelled faintly of dew and old leaves. When I knelt by the same flower bed as yesterday, I began pulling weeds with a steady rhythm. My hands remembered the feeling, even though it had been years since I had worked in any real garden. Dirt settled into the creases of my gloves, and the earth softened under my touch. There was something grounding about it, something that reminded me that things can be revived if someone is willing to give them time. I stayed longer than I had planned and trimmed the edges of the pathway before picking up pieces of litter scattered near the benches. Hours passed quietly, and for once, the quiet did not feel heavy. It felt peaceful. When I finally looked up, the light had shifted, and shadows stretched differently across the ground. My body ached in small, familiar ways that told me I had done something real, something useful. On my way home, a woman walking her dog glanced at me, and then at the tools in my hands. She smiled in a polite but curious way and said it was nice to see someone caring for the park again. Her comment was casual, but it lingered with me the rest of the day. It reminded me how even the smallest effort can ripple outward. That afternoon, I cleaned up my porch as if preparing myself for a new routine. I watered a plant that I had forgotten to tend and wiped the dust off my chair by the window. I noticed things I had been ignoring for years and found myself wanting to fix them. It was strange how caring for one thing outside had awakened a desire to care for my own space, too. Over the next several days, I returned to the park again and again. I planted a few new flowers in the empty bed and trimmed the overgrown shrubs near the swings. I swept fallen leaves away from the walkway and oiled the metal chains of the swings that cried out with every breeze. Each day I saw tiny changes, a bit more color in the soil, a bit more shape in the pathways, a bit more life in the air. One morning, while I was sweeping near the benches, an elderly man with kind eyes approached me and said he remembered when the park was full of families and weekend picnics. He said he had stopped coming because it felt too sad to look at, but he thanked me for trying to bring it back. Something warmed inside my chest at his words. They made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in a long time. Later that day, I sat alone on one of the benches I had cleaned and watched the slow movement of clouds overhead. My thoughts stretched far, wandering through memories of years when my life felt fuller. The quiet around me no longer felt like a void. It felt like space for something to grow. I began to imagine children running again across the grass, and women sitting together sharing stories and laughter. I imagined the park once more becoming a place where people felt safe to breathe deeply. That vision held me steady. It became something I carried with me each morning when I walked across the street with my tools. The more time I spent in the park, the more time I wanted to spend there. I found myself lingering even after my tasks were done, simply watching the way sunlight filtered through the branches of the bigger trees. I wondered how many seasons those trees had watched pass by. I wondered how many more they would see if someone cared enough to help the space around them feel alive again. My days began to change without me planning it. Instead of waking in a house filled with silence, I woke with purpose. Instead of drifting from room to room without direction, I prepared myself to step outside. Even my nights felt different. When I lay in bed listening to the house around me, the silence no longer carried the same ache. I began to feel tired in a satisfying way, the way a person feels after doing something meaningful. I did not realize how much the park had begun to reshape me until one afternoon when I stood in the middle of it and looked around. The place was still far from perfect. It still needed more work than I alone could give, but it no longer looked abandoned. It looked like it was on its way back, and I felt the same. I stayed until the light began to fade, and crickets started whispering in the grass. When I finally walked home, I felt a fullness in my chest that I had not felt in years. It was fragile, but real. It was the feeling of belonging to something, even if that something was just a tired park finding its way back to life with me. I remember the morning when everything shifted in a way I could feel deep in my chest, a slow but certain turning point that came not with a dramatic moment, but with something small and almost ordinary. I was trimming the edge of a pathway that curved toward the old swing set when I noticed a mother standing at a distance with her little girl. They seemed uncertain about stepping inside, as if the place still belonged more to its memories than to the present. The girl kept tugging at her mother's sleeve, her eyes fixed on the swings, and after a moment, the woman finally nodded. They walked slowly across the grass, and I stepped aside to give them space. The little girl climbed onto one of the swings that I had oiled the day before, and when her mother pushed her, the chains moved with a smooth and easy glide. The sound was soft and steady, nothing like the tired groan it used to make. Hearing it felt like listening to a heartbeat returning after a long quiet. The mother gave me a warm nod, the kind of silent recognition that carries gratitude without words, and for a moment, I stood there, feeling something swell inside me that I had not felt in years. I kept working as they played, but my mind drifted into a place where memories and hopes blended together. I remembered watching my own children in a playground long ago, how their laughter would wrap itself around me like sunlight. Those years had slipped by faster than I understood at the time, leaving only echoes that grew quieter with each passing season. Yet here I was, standing in a place that suddenly felt familiar again, not because of anything I had lost, but because of what I was starting to rediscover. Later that afternoon, the little girl ran over to me with a small yellow flower clutched in her hand. She said she found it near the tree line and wanted me to have it. Her voice was high and bright, and the gesture was so innocent that it caught me off guard. I thanked her and watched her run back to her mother, her small figure weaving through the tall blades of grass. I held that tiny flower between my fingers and felt a warmth move through me, as if someone had placed a spark directly into the center of my chest. It amazed me how something so simple could carry so much meaning. That evening, once they had left, I stayed in the park longer than usual. The air was soft and smelled of warm soil. I sat on a bench and let the quiet surround me. It felt different now, not empty, but open, as if waiting for something new to arrive. I realized that I had begun talking to the park in my mind as though it were an old friend, telling it about my thoughts and listening to its silence in return. I felt a connection to it that surprised me, a sense that we were healing each other in ways that neither of us could have done alone. In the days that followed, I noticed more small signs of life returning. A teenager jogging slowly around the path, an older couple walking hand in hand near the trees, a group of children racing across the grass with a ball. These moments were scattered at first, like the first drops of rain before a storm gathers strength, but each one felt significant. They told me that people were beginning to trust the park again, beginning to see it not as a forgotten place, but as a space worth returning to. One morning, 3 women came together and paused near where I was kneeling by a new patch of flowers. They introduced themselves with easy smiles and asked if I needed any help. Their voices carried warmth and curiosity, and I felt a flutter of nervousness followed by a deep sense of gratitude. I told them they were welcome to join me any time, and the way their faces lit up reminded me how much people long for connection, even when they pretend not to. They stayed for almost an hour, pulling weeds and talking with an energy that filled the space around us. They laughed about small things and shared pieces of their lives in a way that felt natural and unforced. I found myself laughing with them, genuinely laughing in a way that loosened something tight inside me. When they finally left, their footsteps fading down the sidewalk, the park felt brighter. As the days passed, these women began returning regularly. Sometimes they brought coffee, sometimes they brought snacks, sometimes they brought nothing but their presence, and that was enough. I realized that in tending to the park, I had also created a soft invitation for others to step into a space where they could meet and talk and feel part of something. It was never a plan. It was simply something that happened because I had shown up and kept showing up. One afternoon, while we worked together pulling leaves from the walkway, one of the women asked how I ended up taking care of the park in the first place. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to put the feeling into words. Then I told them the truth. I said I had been lonely, but I needed something to hold on to, something that made me feel awake again. I said the park felt like a place that had been abandoned, just like I felt abandoned by the rush of life around me. When I finished speaking, no one gave me pity. They simply nodded in understanding. It was the kind of understanding that does not need to be explained. It just exists between people who have lived long enough to recognize the silent battles others carry. We kept working without needing to say more. The sun dipped lower, painting the grass with amber light that made everything look softer. I watched my shadows stretch beside theirs along the ground and felt a strong sense of belonging. I understood then that something important had begun. I had reclaimed a part of myself by reclaiming this place, and now others were stepping into that reclamation with me. It felt like watching a quiet miracle unfold in real time. There was a morning when I felt something new rising inside me, with the same quiet strength that comes when dawn pushes away the last trace of night. I walked toward the park, carrying my tools as I always did, but the moment I stepped onto the grass, I sensed a difference in the air. It was not dramatic or loud. It was a kind of gentle anticipation, the feeling you get when you open a door and know someone has been waiting on the other side. The sky was soft with pale light, and the trees were stirring in a calm breeze that brushed against my face like a familiar hand. I took my usual place near the walkway, kneeling beside the flowers I had planted weeks before, and began pulling away the dry leaves that had gathered there. My hands moved with an ease that came from habit, but my thoughts moved towards something more emotional, a reflection on how far both the park and I had come. I remembered the first day I stepped into this neglected space, how the soil felt dry and forgotten, how the benches looked worn and tired, how even the sunlight had seemed reluctant to settle here. I remembered how deeply lonely I felt in those early mornings when I stood by my window and wondered how many more quiet days I could endure without losing something essential inside myself. Now, as I worked in the fresh morning air, I felt the presence of people around me even before I heard their voices. I felt it in the soft hush of footsteps approaching from different corners of the park. One by one, familiar faces appeared. The same 3 women who had helped me before arrived with bright smiles and warm greetings. A young man who had recently taken up jogging slowed his pace and asked if I needed help carrying the watering can. A mother pushing a stroller waved at me with an ease that made her feel like an old friend, even though we had exchanged only a handful of words. The park that once held nothing but silence now felt like a living place filled with traces of laughter, conversations, and shared care. I noticed a little boy crouched near the tree line, studying something in the grass. He called out to me when he spotted a small patch of wildflowers blooming beside a fallen branch. His excitement pulled me toward him, and when I knelt beside him, he told me that the flowers looked like they were smiling. I felt a sudden sting of emotion rise in my throat. Children have a way of seeing life with an honesty adults sometimes forget, and the idea that the flowers could smile made the world feel innocent again for a moment. As the hours passed, the park became livelier. A group of teenagers gathered near the benches, practicing a choreography that made them burst into laughter whenever their steps collided. An older couple walked slowly along the path, stopping to admire the new shrubs I had planted. 2 women sat on a picnic blanket, sipping iced tea while talking in soft tones that blended with the sounds of the breeze. I stood back and watched all of it unfold with a kind of quiet awe. I realized that the park no longer felt like something I was trying to rescue. It felt like something that had already been saved. At midday, the 3 women who often worked beside me joined me near the flower bed. We watered the plants together while talking about ordinary things like recipes, books, and memories from younger years. There was no pressure in the conversation. It flowed easily and naturally, like water finding its way through a stream. Their voices blended with the soft rustling of leaves above us and the distant laughter of children. For a moment, I closed my eyes and simply listened. I felt a peace that came not from silence, but from belonging. Later in the afternoon, I sat alone on the bench near the swings, the same bench where I once sat feeling like an observer rather than a participant in the world around me. Now I felt the complete opposite. The park was alive with movement and sound. The grass shimmered in the sunlight. The swings moved with gentle arcs as children took turns pushing each other. The air smelled of fresh earth and blooming flowers. I let myself breathe in all of it, letting the feeling settle into my chest like a warm memory I knew would never leave. I began to think about how strange it was that I had not planned any of this. I had stepped into the park because I was lonely, because the silence of my home had grown too deep, and because something inside me whispered that maybe I could bring life back to a forgotten place. I never imagined that by doing so, I would bring life back to myself. I never imagined that others would join me, or that a neglected space would become a gathering place that felt like a second home. I watched as the sky shifted toward the soft colors of late afternoon. Shadows stretched across the grass, while the light grew warmer and gentler. People slowly gathered their things and began heading home. The sounds of the park softened until only a few lingering footsteps and distant voices remained. I stayed seated for a while longer, letting the stillness return. It felt different now, not like loneliness, but like the quiet calm that follows a fulfilling day. I knew that tomorrow I would be back here again. I knew others would come too. And I knew that this place, once forgotten, would continue to grow into something beautiful. As I finally stood to leave, I glanced back at the park one more time. The trees stood tall against the fading light. The flowers I had planted moved gently in the evening breeze. I felt a deep gratitude rise within me, not just for what the park had become, but for what it had returned to my life. I walked home slowly, carrying a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. And as I stepped onto my porch, I realized something clear and simple. I had thought I was saving the park, but somewhere along the way, the park had saved me too. I woke the next day with a sense of anticipation that felt almost like the morning of a long-awaited reunion, the kind where you know something meaningful is waiting for you even before you step out of the house. I moved through my kitchen with a kind of quiet energy, rinsing my cup and stirring my tea while sunlight slowly crept across the counter. The air felt lighter, as if the world itself had exhaled during the night. When I looked out the window, the park seemed to glow with a gentle brightness that pulled me toward it, the way a familiar voice might call softly from another room. I walked across the street with my tools and a small bag of fresh seeds. My footsteps felt more confident than they used to. For months they had carried hesitation, but now they carried purpose. When I stepped onto the grass, I paused for a moment and let the morning air settle around me. Birds were perched along the branches of the tallest trees, singing with an ease that made the entire place feel like it had finally remembered what it was meant to be. I began watering the flowers near the walkway. Their petals had opened beautifully, stretching toward the sun with the kind of unguarded trust only nature can hold. While I worked, I heard the soft shuffle of someone approaching. It was the older couple who visited often. They smiled at me as they passed. The woman complimented the flowers, and the man pointed toward the shrubs I had planted earlier, saying they reminded him of the ones his mother used to grow. Their words wrapped around me with a warmth that lingered long after they moved on. I kept working until the sound of children's voices drifted across the park. A group of them arrived with their parents, running toward the open grass with a kind of excited freedom that made everything feel young again. Their laughter carried through the air like music. One of the mothers waved at me, calling out that she brought extra snacks if anyone wanted to share later. I felt a soft smile rise on my face. Months ago, I would have felt out of place in such moments, unsure of how to step into the simple ease of community. Now I felt like I was part of something unfolding naturally around me. I made my way toward the community garden area I had started. It had grown far beyond what I originally imagined. The women who helped me often had added herbs and small vegetables. A teenager from the neighborhood painted a simple wooden sign that said, "Growing Together." And even though the words were modest, they held a meaning that ran deep. As I tended to the soil, I felt the sun warming my back. The scent of earth rose with each handful I turned, dark and rich and full of promise. Gardening had become more than an act of care for the park. It was a meditation, a way of grounding myself in something steady. I found comfort in the repetition of it, the ease of knowing that each small action created something a little better than before. The women arrived soon after, each carrying something small but meaningful. One brought a watering can, another carried a basket of fresh mulch. The third brought sandwiches she had made at home. They gathered around me with natural familiarity, and we began working side by side. Our conversation flowed easily. We talked about childhood memories, favorite books, friendships that had changed with time, and moments of courage we did not always recognize in ourselves until years later. I realized how rare it was to have conversations that felt both gentle and deep, the kind where honesty arrived without force, and trust built itself quietly between shared tasks. At one point, I stood up to stretch my back and looked around at the scene taking shape. The children playing near the swings, the older couple walking arm in arm, a young mother bouncing her baby gently as she talked to another parent, the women beside me laughing softly as they wiped dirt from their gloves. For a moment, the entire park looked like a living painting, a blend of movement and warmth and connection, shaped not by grand events, but by the steady presence of ordinary people who cared enough to show up. A soft emotion rose inside me, one that felt both tender and full. I remembered the early days when none of this existed, when the park was empty and silent, and I was lost in my own quietness. I remembered the weight of loneliness sitting beside me like an unwelcome companion, filling my home with an ache that touched everything. And now, here I was, surrounded by life I had helped nurture, but could never have created alone. When afternoon arrived, the women and I sat together on the grass, sharing the sandwiches they had brought. The ground felt warm beneath us, and our conversation drifted from stories to quiet moments of simple appreciation. I felt the breeze touch my hair, warm and soft, as if reminding me that life has seasons far beyond what we see. After they left, I stayed in the garden a while longer. I planted the new seeds I brought and smoothed the soil gently with my hands. The sun began to lower itself slowly across the sky, painting the trees with a soft gold that made their leaves shimmer. As I worked, I thought about the person I used to be before all of this began. I thought about the long, quiet evenings when I felt invisible, when I wondered if my life had already become something fixed and unchanging. I realized now how untrue that fear had been. I had grown in ways I did not expect, and the park had grown with me. The two of us had changed together, each encouraging the other to rise again. When I finally stood and brushed the dirt from my gloves, I breathed in the scent of the garden and felt a calm strength inside me. The park had become a place of renewal, and so had I. I walked home slowly as the last light of the day settled behind the trees. My heart felt full in a way that was gentle rather than overwhelming, a steady warmth that reminded me that healing does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with a seed, a helping hand, a shared laugh, or a simple moment in a garden. A place once forgotten, but now full of life. I returned to the park early the next morning with a feeling I could not quite name. It was not excitement, though it carried a spark. It was not sorrow, though a trace of something tender lingered beneath it. It felt more like standing on the edge of a moment I did not yet understand, as if the day was waiting to show me something important, but gentle enough not to startle me. The path was still wet from the night's light rain, and the air held the coolness that comes before the sun fully claims the day. I walked slowly, letting my steps set a quiet rhythm while I watched the trees shimmer with droplets that caught the morning light like small pieces of glass. The stillness made the park feel almost sacred, not in a grand or dramatic way, but in the way familiar spaces become sacred when they hold our stories without judgment. I reached the garden and knelt beside the new seeds I had planted the day before. The soil was cool and soft beneath my fingertips. I ran my hand gently across the surface, almost as if offering reassurance to something living but unseen. Birds began to stir in the branches above me, and their soft voices wove together like threads of sound. The world felt awake but unhurried. For a while, I stayed there, letting the quiet settle inside me. I surprised myself with the calm I felt. There was a time when quiet moments made me uneasy. They reminded me of what I lacked, of conversations I wished I had, of connections I longed for but never found. Now the quiet felt like a companion I could trust. Still, I sensed something shifting in me, something I could feel but not yet name. I stood and walked toward the far side of the park, where the older trees created a generous canopy. Their branches bent toward each other as if in conversation. This had always been one of my favorite places. I used to sit here alone, wondering if life had forgotten me. Today, I sat with a sense of peace that felt earned rather than accidental. I leaned back against the trunk of one of the trees and closed my eyes. I listened to the breeze rustling through the leaves. I could hear the faint sound of someone jogging in the distance and the soft hum of the world coming alive. As I sat there, I felt a sudden wave of emotion rise inside me. It came without warning, the way memories often do. I remembered the first week I started volunteering at the park. I had been hesitant and unsure of myself. I had hidden behind tasks, pretending I was only there to clean and repair the grounds. The truth was, I was there because I was trying to keep myself from falling apart. I remembered how lost I felt then, how distant from everything and everyone. It struck me now how far I had come without fully noticing it. The progress had not been loud or dramatic. It had been slow, steady, and almost invisible as it unfolded. I opened my eyes and felt a cool breeze brush across my face. It felt like the world was acknowledging the moment with me. After a while, I rose and continued walking. When I reached the community garden, I heard someone calling my name. It was one of the women who often joined me. She approached with a smile and 2 cups of warm tea. She handed one to me, and we stood together for a moment, sipping quietly. She told me she had been thinking about starting a small reading circle for anyone who wanted to join. She asked if I thought people would come. I told her they would, because people gravitate toward sincerity. She laughed softly and said she hoped I would be part of it. Her invitation touched me more deeply than she knew. There was a time when no one would have asked me to join anything. There was a time when I would have said no, even if they did. Now, the simple idea of sitting with others to share stories felt like another step toward a life that was expanding rather than shrinking. We spent the next hour tending to the plants and talking about small things. The kind of small things that feel unimportant, but weave a sense of belonging around you without asking for anything in return. Soon the mothers began arriving with their children. The sound of laughter returned to the air with its usual brightness. The children paused to look at the new seedlings and asked when they would grow tall enough to touch. Their innocence made the entire garden feel more alive. One of the children handed me a pebble shaped like a heart. He said he found it near the swing and thought I should keep it. I turned it over in my hand, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through me. It was such a simple gesture, yet it reached a part of my heart that had been quiet for a long time. The older couple arrived later in the morning. They walked slowly, their hands intertwined the way vines wrap around each other for support. They stopped to admire the flowers and told me they thought the park looked better than it had in years. Their appreciation felt sincere and unhurried. They often reminded me that life's beauty is found in small consistencies, not grand events. As the day grew warmer, more people filled the park. Some walked with their dogs, others sat on benches with books. A group of teenagers practiced a dance routine near the open lawn. The energy was lively but peaceful, as if every person carried a piece of the transformation we had all created together. By early afternoon, The women and I decided to rest under the shade of the large trees. We laid a blanket on the grass and shared fruit and bread. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above us, creating patterns that danced across our hands and faces. One of the women asked how I had first decided to care for the park. Her question caught me off guard. No one had ever asked it so directly. I hesitated before answering. I told her the truth. I told her I began coming here because I needed something steady when everything inside me felt like it was drifting apart. I told her that the park gave me a reason to step outside, a reason to keep moving, a reason to believe that even small efforts matter. She listened with a softness that made the moment feel safe. She reached over and squeezed my hand gently. She said she understood more than I realized. Her simple response felt like a bridge between us, built from shared experience rather than shared words. When the sun began to lower, we packed our things and walked toward the garden together. We checked the soil one last time and watered the plants before heading home. As I stood there watching the last light settle across the leaves, I felt that same unnamed feeling rise again. It felt like something was opening inside me, like a door that had been stuck for years had finally loosened. I walked home slowly, carrying the warm teacup she had given me earlier. The world around me glowed with a soft, late afternoon gold. I realized the feeling I could not name was a quiet kind of hope. Not the loud hope people talk about when they promise things will get better, but the gentle hope that grows from showing up, from being seen, from letting yourself belong again. I woke the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that felt strange after the peaceful day before. It was not sadness exactly. It was more like a slow, thoughtful ache that comes when you are finally honest with yourself about something you have ignored for a long time. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to the faint hum of the neighborhood outside my window. Birds were already awake. A car passed somewhere down the street. The world was moving, even if I was not ready yet. I sat up and rubbed my hands together, noticing how tired they looked. 65 years had left their story on my skin. For a moment, I traced the lines on my palm and thought about how many things I had touched in my life, how many things I had let go of, how many moments had slipped through without me understanding their value. I thought about how lonely I had been before the park began to pull me back into the world. I thought about how easy it had been to tell myself that loneliness was safer than trying again. That morning, those thoughts felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was because yesterday had been full of connection and kindness. Sometimes joy makes you notice the emptiness that used to sit where it now rests. I stood and opened my curtains. The park looked calm from my window. A soft mist hung over the grass, and the early light made everything look pale and gentle. I felt pulled toward it, the way I had in the beginning. Not because I needed to save it, but because it had become the one place where I could hear myself clearly. I dressed slowly and made myself tea. The warmth of the cup helped steady me a little. As I walked down the steps of my porch, I felt the cool air brush across my face. It woke me more fully than the tea had. By the time I reached the small gate that separated my yard from the sidewalk, I could feel some of the heaviness lifting, the way fog lifts when the sun begins to warm the earth. When I entered the park, it was empty, except for a man walking his dog near the far path. The mist made everything look softened around the edges, as if the world had been painted with a gentle hand. I walked toward the garden and stood there quietly. The new seedlings looked fragile but determined. Their tiny green edges broke through the soil like small promises. I crouched down and brushed the ground around them with my fingertips. I felt a sudden wave of tenderness, not just for the plants, but for the part of myself that had planted them, a part that had been trying, even when I told myself I was only passing time. After a while, I moved to one of the benches and sat. I wrapped my hands around my warm cup and watched the mist rise from the grass. The quiet felt heavy, but not unfriendly. It gave me room to think about something I had avoided. For years before I found the park, I had lived inside a silence that never asked me to explain anything. I had convinced myself that it was easier to stay small and unnoticed, easier not to expect anything from anyone, easier to believe that life had already decided my story and that I was only meant to finish it quietly. But the truth was that I had been afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of caring, afraid of being the only one who showed up. And as I sat there that morning, I realized I did not want to live that way anymore. The park had changed because I had shown up for it. And somewhere in that process, I had learned how to show up for myself again. I took a slow breath and let that thought settle inside me. Soon I saw the familiar group of women arriving near the playground. They waved when they saw me. Their presence warmed something in me that had felt cold earlier. I stood and walked toward them. They were carrying small baskets with snacks, and two of them had brought extra gloves for gardening. One told me her daughter wanted to join us later. Another said her husband planned to help build new bird feeders next weekend. I felt a smile spread across my face before I could stop it. We spent the morning pulling weeds, checking the soil, and trimming overgrown branches along the walking path. The women talked about their families, their plans for the week, and the small frustrations that filled their days. They trusted the space enough to speak honestly. That alone felt like a gift. Sometimes they laughed so loudly the sound echoed across the park. Each time that happened, I felt another piece of my old loneliness fall away. Around midday, we rested on the benches near the open field. A few children ran around with kites that could barely lift off the ground. Their determination made us laugh. I watched them and felt a soft ache in my chest, the kind of ache that reminds you of years gone by, but no longer hurts. One of the women asked if I had slept well. I almost told her the truth. I almost said I woke with a heaviness I could not explain. But instead, I told her I was fine because I knew she was asking out of kindness, not curiosity. That alone made the weight inside me feel easier to hold. As the day went on, more people arrived. Some brought snacks, others brought water for the plants. A few teenagers joined us for the first time. They said they wanted to earn community service hours, but their energy felt genuine. They worked hard, trimming branches, sweeping paths, and clearing the edges of the walkway. I felt proud watching them, proud that this place had become something people wanted to care for. Later in the afternoon, I walked alone to the far edge of the park. I needed a moment of quiet again, not the lonely kind, but the reflective kind. I stood beneath a tall tree whose branches reached wide like open arms. I felt the breeze move through my hair, and I closed my eyes. I thought about how different my life looked now compared to just a few months ago. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who watched the world from behind a window and convinced herself she was safer there. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, wanted to tell her she would not be alone forever. I wanted to tell her that hope can return even when you think it has forgotten your name. I opened my eyes and looked around the park. It was alive, not just with people, but with connection, with purpose, with warmth. And I realized something simple and undeniable. I had rebuilt the park, but the park had rebuilt me too. When I walked home that evening, the sky was painted with soft pink light. My steps felt steady. My heart felt open. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever the next morning would bring. I woke before the sun and lay there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the quiet house around me. The air felt cooler than usual, and the sheets held a softness that made it tempting to stay still. Yet something inside me urged me to rise. It was not restlessness exactly. It felt more like a quiet pull, as if the morning itself was calling my name. I brushed my hair back and sat at the edge of the bed, letting my feet find the familiar coolness of the floor. My thoughts drifted to the park without me meaning to guide them. I pictured the mist that sometimes clings to the grass, the slow brightening of the sky, the shapes of the trees in the early light. The image felt so peaceful that it warmed something in me even before I stood up. I moved to the window and opened the curtain. The world was still wrapped in that soft bluish light that only appears for a brief moment before sunrise. From where I stood, I could see the faint outline of the pathways and the large branches of the trees stretching out like dark silhouettes. I breathed in and let my shoulders relax. The calm felt like an invitation. After dressing, I made myself a warm drink and stepped outside. The morning air touched my skin with a coolness that felt almost cleansing. I walked slowly toward the park, enjoying the silence that surrounds a neighborhood before most people begin their day. When I entered the park, a soft mist hovered close to the ground, and each breath formed a faint cloud in the air. I held my cup close and walked toward the garden. The smell of damp soil greeted me. It made me think of new beginnings, the kind that grow quietly long before anyone notices. I knelt beside the seedlings and studied them with a tenderness that felt almost protective. They were growing more quickly than I expected. Their tiny leaves reached upward, so small and delicate, yet full of a determination that felt familiar. I touched the soil lightly. It felt cool and moist. I whispered a small thank you to the earth without thinking, as if gratitude had become a natural part of my morning. I stood and stretched my back. As I turned toward the benches, I noticed someone approaching. It was the older man who sometimes walked at dawn. His steps were slow but steady. He offered a gentle nod as he passed, and I returned it with a soft smile. There was something comforting about sharing the quiet with someone else, even when no words were spoken. I sat on the bench and let my thoughts wander. I thought about how much time I used to spend closed inside my house, believing I had nothing left to give. I remembered how many mornings I had avoided the sunlight because facing the world felt too heavy. The memory felt distant now, like a story someone else had told me. I sipped my drink and watched the mist slowly lift. The sky brightened from blue to pale gold. A few birds flew overhead, and the sound of their wings cut through the stillness in a way that felt familiar and grounding. Soon I heard footsteps and soft voices approaching. The women arrived earlier than usual. They carried small baskets filled with fruit and bread. Their faces looked fresh and expectant in the new light. They greeted me with warm smiles that felt like rays of sunlight in their own way. One of them sat beside me and said she had woken with a strong urge to come early because she felt the morning would be special. I told her I had felt something similar. She placed her hand briefly over mine and said sometimes understanding does not need explanation. We waited for the others to settle their things before beginning our morning tasks. The garden was quiet, except for the faint rustle of leaves. Working side by side with these women felt different now. There was an ease among us that had taken time to grow. We no longer hesitated with each other. We shared responsibilities naturally, as if we had always known how to move together. As we worked, one of the women began talking about her mother, who had passed away many years earlier. She said her mother loved to garden and believed that plants responded to kindness. As she spoke, her voice softened, and she paused, as if holding a memory in her hands. Without discussing it, we all moved closer. Sometimes closeness is the only comfort a moment needs. She finished by saying she felt her mother's presence whenever she worked with soil. Her words brought a warmth to the air that lingered even after she fell silent. I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness exactly, more like a recognition of how deeply the park had become tied to the stories of the people who cared for it. It held more than plants and pathways. It held pieces of our lives, pieces we had once carried alone. By the time the sun rose fully, the park felt alive. Children arrived with boundless energy. Their laughter carried across the grass in bright ribbons of sound. The teenagers returned and waved at us as they headed toward the far path to continue the trimming they had begun earlier. The older couple walked in slowly, their hands intertwined as usual. They paused at the garden to admire the new growth and told us how beautiful everything looked. I felt gratitude bloom inside me, steady and full. Late in the morning, we set up a small picnic under the large tree near the garden. It was not planned, but the moment asked for it. We spread a blanket over the grass and passed around fruit, bread, and warm drinks. We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of talk that fills the air with comfort rather than noise. At one point, one of the women asked me if I had ever imagined my life would look like this again. The question touched me in a place I rarely let anyone reach. I hesitated before answering. I told her honestly that I had once believed my life had already passed its brightest days. I said I had convinced myself that loneliness was easier than hope because hope felt fragile. She listened carefully, then placed her hand on my arm. She told me that fragility and strength often grow in the same place. Her words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. As the day warmed, the park grew livelier, but my heart felt unusually calm. I stood a few feet away from the group and watched them laugh together. I watched children chase each other. I watched sunlight shimmer against the leaves. And I felt a sense of belonging settle into my bones with a steadiness I had not known in years. Later in the afternoon, when the crowd thinned and the air grew quieter again, I walked toward the far end of the park. I needed a moment to breathe in the day. I stood beneath the tall tree and placed my hand on its trunk. The bark felt rough and cool and solid. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the sun touch my face. I thought about who I used to be when I first walked into this park. I thought about the woman who felt invisible, the woman who watched her life from a distance, the woman who carried silence like a shield. I realized I no longer recognized her, not because she was gone, but because she had softened. She had opened. She had learned how to hope again. When I opened my eyes, the park looked brighter than before. The grass shimmered in the sunlight. The sky stretched wide and welcoming, and I felt something inside me shift gently into place. A feeling that was neither loud nor dramatic. A feeling that said, I was exactly where I needed to be. I woke with the sound of soft rain tapping gently against my window, as if the morning was knocking to see if I was awake. For a long moment, I stayed still and listened to the steady rhythm. There was something calming about rain, especially the kind that falls without hurry. It reminded me of the way emotions sometimes arrive, quiet at first, then steady, then impossible to ignore. I turned on my side and looked toward the curtain. A dim gray light filled the room. I could tell it was still early. The world outside felt muted and thoughtful, the kind of morning that invites reflection, whether you ask for it or not. I sat up slowly and stretched my arms. My joints felt stiff in a familiar way that comes with age, but not in a way that bothered me. 65 years had taught me to be patient with myself. I stood and walked to the window. When I pushed the curtain aside, I saw the park shrouded in a soft blanket of mist. The rain was gentle, barely more than a fine drizzle. The trees looked darker against the muted sky. The pathways glistened like silver threads. Even from my window, I could feel the quiet beauty of it. I brewed a warm drink and held the cup in both hands, letting the heat seep into my fingers. For a moment, I thought about staying indoors. The idea of sitting in my kitchen while listening to the rain was tempting, but something in me resisted the thought. The park had become a part of my mornings in a way that felt deeper than routine. It felt like a place where I went to meet myself. Rain or not, I knew I needed to go. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cool air wrapped around me the way a soft blanket wraps around your shoulders when you are not quite ready to wake. I walked down my porch steps carefully. The wood was damp under my feet. The street was quiet except for the sound of rain touching leaves and the faint splash of water collecting in the gutters. When I reached the park, I inhaled deeply. The air smelled clean and earthy. Rain always brings out the scent of soil and leaves in a way that feels grounding. The mist drifted low near the ground and made everything look dreamlike. I walked toward the garden path, feeling each step connect with the softened earth beneath me. The garden was almost unrecognizable in the rain. The colors looked deeper and richer. The petals of the flowers glistened with beads of water. The seedlings looked even more fragile, but also more hopeful. I knelt and touched the soil. It was damp and cool. I brushed a few small puddles away from the base of the tiny plants to keep them from drowning. The rain felt soft on my back and shoulders, like a gentle presence rather than a nuisance. As I worked, I became aware of footsteps behind me. I turned and saw one of the women approaching with an umbrella. She held it above both of us without saying anything at first. Her smile was soft, and her voice even softer when she finally spoke. She said she knew I would be here. I laughed under my breath and told her she must be able to read my mind. She said it was not that. She said some people simply become part of a place, and the place calls them when it needs them. Her words surprised me. They were honest and kind and unexpected. We worked in silence for a few minutes. The rain pattered steadily on the umbrella above us. The sound reminded me of the way someone hums without words when they want to comfort you. Soon, another woman arrived, then another. None of us had planned to meet that morning, yet there we were, gathered in the rain, tending to the garden as if it were a living piece of all of us. We pulled weeds. We checked the roots of a few plants. We brushed water from the leaves. Sometimes we spoke. Sometimes we listened. Sometimes we simply worked quietly, side by side. It felt like a small community forming in real time, shaped by shared effort and quiet understanding. Around mid-morning, the rain began to lighten. The mist lifted slowly, revealing more of the park. The playground glistened with raindrops. The swing seats were slick and shiny. The wooden benches looked darker and polished by the rain. A few children appeared with bright boots and ponchos. Their mothers held umbrellas above their heads while they splashed in tiny puddles. Their laughter cut through the soft quiet and brought a brightness that made the entire park feel awake. One of the women beside me said she loved rainy days because they made people softer. She said rain invites patience and kindness. I found myself agreeing. Something about the world slowing down brings out a tenderness that often hides beneath the surface of busy days. As the morning went on, the rain stopped entirely. The clouds began to thin, and a pale light shone through. The air felt fresh and alive. The ground shimmered with droplets that caught the light like hundreds of tiny mirrors. We decided to rest on one of the benches. I wiped it dry with a towel I carried, and we sat there, enjoying the coolness of the air. We shared warm drinks and a few pieces of fruit someone had brought in a small container. One of the women leaned back and sighed in that relieved way people sigh when they feel safe and unhurried. She told us she had been struggling with her own loneliness long before she joined us. She said she had felt invisible in her own home, unheard even in rooms filled with noise. Her honesty settled over us like a soft blanket. We listened without interrupting, not out of politeness, but out of respect. When she finished speaking, she looked at me with eyes that held both gratitude and a quiet ache. She said the park had given her something she did not know she needed. I felt a warm heaviness in my chest. I told her I understood. I told her I had walked into the park for the first time because I needed something steady to hold on to, something that would not walk away from me, something that would not disappear when I needed it most. She nodded as if the truth she carried touched the truth I carried. As the day brightened, more people arrived. A few teenagers took shelter under the large oak tree to avoid puddles. The older couple strolled in with their usual grace. They paused to admire the fresh glimmer of the grass and told us how beautiful the park looked after a rain. I watched them walk slowly across the path, their hands intertwined as always. The sight filled me with a soft longing, but not the painful kind. It was more like a gentle reminder of the kind of companionship that still exists in the world. Later in the afternoon, when the park grew quieter again, I walked alone toward the far end. I stood beneath the tall tree whose branches reached high into the open sky. Water dripped from its leaves in slow, steady droplets that landed softly on the ground. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. The air smelled fresh and earthy and alive. I thought about how much my life had changed since the day I first stepped into this park. I thought about the loneliness I used to carry, the weight of it, the way it shaped my days, the way it convinced me that my life had already shrunk beyond repair. Now, standing beneath that tree with sunlight breaking through the clouds, I felt none of that heaviness. Instead, I felt steady, present, connected. I opened my eyes and watched the light shimmer across the wet grass. In that moment, I understood something simple and profound. Healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes like rain, quiet at first, then steady, then impossible to ignore. I spent the next morning feeling as if something inside me had been rearranged overnight, as if the air around me had shifted into a deeper stillness that followed me from room to room. I tried to move through my day the way I usually did, but every ordinary action felt heavier, almost deliberate, as if I had to convince myself to keep going. I washed my face, brushed my hair, made a cup of tea, and sat at the edge of the bed with my hands wrapped around the warm mug. The steam curled up into the quiet of the room and touched my cheek, and for a moment, I let myself believe that the softness of the morning was a sign that I was allowed to feel everything without hiding anything. I looked toward the window and watched the light shift against the curtains, creating slow ripples that reminded me of the way water moves when you drop a single pebble into a still pond. It widens and widens until it touches every edge, and that was exactly how my thoughts felt. One small memory would fall into my mind, and it would push the others out until everything inside me was moving at once. I breathed slowly and tried to steady myself, but the weight of the past few days kept rising again, reminding me of the way life has its own rhythm, one that does not care if you are ready for it or not. I kept replaying the conversations I had avoided, the ones I had half finished, the ones I had chosen silence over because I feared the answers more than the uncertainty. It is strange how silence can feel peaceful and painful at the same time. Peaceful because it protects you, painful because it keeps you alone. I placed the empty cup aside and stood up, feeling the familiar drag beneath my ribs that comes when the truth sits too close to the surface. I walked to the mirror and studied my reflection the way someone studies an old photograph they suddenly find in a drawer they rarely open. I traced the shape of my face with my eyes and tried to recognize the woman staring back at me. She looked tired, but she also looked stronger than I expected. There was something in her expression that hinted at a quiet persistence, something I had not paid attention to before. Maybe I had been strong this whole time without even noticing. Maybe strength never arrives like a sudden burst. Maybe it grows the way roots grow, deep beneath what anyone can see. I turned away from the mirror and opened the window to let the cool air move through the room. It brushed across my arms and made me exhale in a way that felt close to relief. I needed that breath, the kind that pulls you out of your thoughts and grounds you in the present. I walked through the hallway and paused at the doorway that led to the living room. The house felt different today, as if the walls were listening and waiting for me to say something honest for the first time in a long while. I tried to remember the last time I allowed myself to sit without trying to solve something or fix something or hide. Something I could not remember. I sat down on the floor instead of the couch because the floor felt more honest. I pulled my knees close and rested my chin on them, feeling the quiet of the house settle around me like a blanket. I thought about the choices I had made and the ones I avoided, the promises I whispered to myself and then ran from, the moments when I wanted to speak but swallowed the words because they felt too sharp and too revealing. I thought about how many times I stood at the edge of something new and stepped back because the past still held me by the wrist. I thought about the people I had kept close and the ones I had kept away, not because I did not care, but because I cared too much and feared losing them before they were even mine to lose. The room grew brighter as the sun climbed, and the light began to settle across the floor in long, soft lines that touched my hands. It made my skin look warmer, almost hopeful, and I found myself relaxing into that warmth the way someone leans into a familiar embrace. I closed my eyes and let myself drift into the quiet rhythm of my breathing. For a little while, I did not think about anything. I simply existed inside the moment, wrapped in the steady rise and fall of my chest. When I opened my eyes again, I felt something loosen inside me, something I had been holding without realizing its weight. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, moving with a calm that surprised me. I took out a notebook from the counter drawer and placed it on the table. I opened to a blank page and held the pen for a moment before writing anything. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingers, steady but aware, as if it understood that this moment mattered. I began writing the truth I had avoided, the words I had carried like small stones in my pockets. I wrote about the fear that always came first. I wrote about the longing that followed behind it. I wrote about the nights when I pretended I was fine, and the mornings when I wished someone would notice that I was not. I wrote until my hand ached and my eyes felt warm. The page filled with sentences I had never said out loud. When I finally stopped, the silence around me felt different, almost approving, as if the house had been waiting for me to give shape to the things I had locked away. I closed the notebook gently and rested my hand on the cover. I felt lighter, not entirely healed, but no longer sinking. I stood up and walked back to the window. The sky looked clearer now, and the air carried a softness that made me believe change was not always loud. Sometimes it arrives slowly, quietly, almost like a whisper, asking you to begin again. I let that thought settle inside me, and I breathed in the promise of it, knowing it was time to step into the next part of my story with honesty instead of fear. I woke up the next morning with a feeling that pressed gently against my ribs, almost like a reminder that something inside me had shifted during the night, even though I had not fully understood it yet. I lay still for a moment and listened to the soft hum of the quiet around me, letting the early light settle across my skin in a thin, warm layer that made the room feel softer than it had the day before. There was a stillness in the air that felt deliberate, as if the morning had paused itself just long enough for me to catch up with the emotions I had been outrunning for so long. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, tracing the familiar lines and tiny imperfections that I had never really noticed before. It was strange how even the plainest details could feel new when something inside you began to open. I pushed myself up slowly, feeling the heaviness of sleep fall away from my shoulders, and sat at the edge of the bed with my feet resting on the cool floor. I stayed like that for a while, breathing quietly, letting the moment stretch into a gentle stillness that steadied me. The quiet felt like a place where I could finally hear myself without interruption. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to let the morning light spill into the room. The sky looked pale and soft, the way it does when the day has not decided what it wants to be yet. I rested my forehead lightly against the window pane and closed my eyes again, letting the cool surface ground me. I stood there until the clutter of my thoughts calmed enough for me to move. When I finally stepped away from the window, I could feel a strange courage rising within me. It was gentle, almost hesitant, but present enough to make me feel as though the day was offering me a choice. I walked toward the small shelf near the door where I kept my notebooks. My hand hovered over the worn spine of the one I had written in the day before. I picked it up and held it against my chest for a moment, breathing slowly as if absorbing whatever strength I had poured into its pages. I opened the cover and read the last lines I had written. They felt raw and honest, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel ashamed of my vulnerability. I felt grateful for it because it had allowed me to finally tell the truth. I turned to a new page and let the pen rest between my fingers without writing anything yet. I waited until my thoughts formed naturally. I wrote about the uncertainty that still clung to me, the kind that does not vanish even after you finally speak your truth. I wrote about the quiet ache of wanting something you cannot fully name, but feel deeply every time you are alone. I wrote about the way the past tries to pull you back, even when you are reaching for something ahead of you. I wrote until the words settled into a steady rhythm that soothed me. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it gently on the table. My hand lingered on the cover, feeling the faint warmth left by my touch. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, noticing the way my reflection wavered slightly on the surface. It reminded me that nothing in life stays perfectly still, not even the parts we try to hold unchanged. I drank slowly and felt the coolness fill me, as if reminding me that I was still here, still moving, still able to begin again. I sat down at the small table near the window, resting my elbows on the wood and letting my thoughts drift. The sunlight filtered through the glass and created small patterns across the surface of the table. I traced one of them with the tip of my finger and thought about all the moments I had allowed fear to silence me. I wondered how many parts of my life had been shaped by hesitation rather than desire. I wondered how many times I had looked at something I wanted and told myself it was safer to look away. I felt a slow warmth rise in my chest, a mixture of sadness and relief, because acknowledging those moments felt like opening a door I had kept locked for years. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, letting the sunlight touch my face. I felt a kind of quiet determination growing inside me, not loud or dramatic, but steady, the way a steady heartbeat is. It made me realize that strength does not always come in bold declarations. Sometimes it grows from small decisions made in silence. After a while, I stood up and reached for my coat. I felt the urge to step outside, not to run from anything, but to breathe in a different air, one that might help me understand what I felt. I opened the door and stepped out onto the small path that led away from my home. The light felt different here, softer as it filtered through the leaves above me. I walked slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps clear my mind. Each step felt like a small release, as if I was letting go of something I had carried for far too long. I walked until I reached a quiet spot where I often stood when I needed to think. I stayed there and let the moment settle around me. The air felt cool against my skin, and the stillness wrapped around me like a soft embrace. I let myself feel everything without pushing anything away. I thought about the path I had walked so far, about the choices I had made, and the ones I still feared. I thought about the possibility of changing my story, not by forcing anything, but by allowing myself to be honest in ways I had never dared before. I stood there until the weight inside my chest softened enough for me to breathe without feeling like I was bracing for something. When I finally turned back toward home, I felt lighter. The sky above me was brighter now, as if the day had finally made its decision. I walked back slowly, feeling a calm certainty settle into my steps. When I reached the door, I paused for a moment before opening it. I placed my hand on the handle and felt the quiet strength in my fingers. I knew the next part of my story would require more honesty than I had ever given myself before. But I also knew I was ready to face it. I opened the door and stepped inside, carrying with me a truth I could no longer hide and a hope I was finally willing to protect. I woke before the sun had fully risen, stirred by a soft sense of anticipation that settled gently across my chest, as if the morning itself had leaned close and whispered that something meaningful was about to begin. For a moment I stayed still, breathing in the quiet that seemed to hold the room in a delicate pause. I felt the sheets warm beneath me, and the faint coolness of the air brushing against my arms. It was the kind of morning that reminded me of childhood, when days felt wide and waiting. I sat up slowly and let the silence settle around me, as if I needed its company, before I stepped into everything that waited beyond the walls of my room. I placed my feet on the floor and felt a grounded calm rise through me. There was a softness in my chest, a gentle certainty that felt new but steady. I pulled the curtain aside and watched the early light touch the edges of the world in thin, quiet lines. The sky held a pale glow that looked almost like a promise. I stood there longer than usual, not because I was unsure of the day ahead, but because I wanted to honor the moment that led me there. I pressed my hand lightly against the window and let the cool glass meet my skin before stepping back. I moved through the house with a slow rhythm, noticing the familiar objects that had witnessed so many seasons of my life. The small framed photo on the shelf, the mug with a faint crack along the rim, the worn book resting beside my chair. I felt a fondness for them that reached deeper than nostalgia. They were pieces of a life I had lived fully, even when I had felt empty. I made myself a warm drink and held the mug in both hands as I sat near the window. The steam rose in soft spirals and brushed my face with a warmth that felt almost affectionate. As I sipped, I let the quiet fill me with a contemplative softness. My mind drifted to the park across the street, the place that had once mirrored my loneliness and now reflected something else entirely. I remembered the early days, when the world there felt abandoned, when the empty benches and overgrown paths echoed the quiet ache I carried inside me. I remembered the moment I decided to change it, not because I knew how, but because I needed something to grow again, and I chose that forgotten space. I smiled softly, thinking of the countless hours I had spent kneeling in the dirt, planting small seeds with trembling hands that hoped for more than they admitted. I thought of the afternoons when I stood alone beside the trees I had pruned, speaking softly to myself as if the branches understood the language of someone trying to rebuild her own spirit. I finished my drink and set the mug down, feeling a warm steadiness settle into my chest. I reached for my coat and slipped it around my shoulders with a familiar ease. I walked to the door and paused with my hand on the handle, letting myself take one slow breath. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to step into the moment with intention. When I opened the door, the cool morning air touched my face and carried with it a soft, earthy scent that reminded me of early spring. I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me before walking toward the park with a calm confidence that surprised me with its quiet strength. The path felt familiar under my feet. I reached the edge of the park and paused, letting my eyes travel slowly over the place that had changed alongside me. The trees stood taller, their leaves glowing with the touch of the early sun. The benches that had once sat in silence were scattered with people, enjoying the beginning of the day. Children's voices floated through the air in bright, joyful bursts that felt like tiny celebrations of life. I walked deeper into the park, greeting the familiar faces of women who had once arrived uncertain, but now came with a sense of belonging. They waved to me with warm smiles, and I felt the quiet pride of someone who had learned to open her heart without fear of being alone. As I continued walking, I saw a group of children near the garden beds. Their small hands hovered above the flowers with a kind of curiosity that made me smile. I walked toward them and knelt beside the newest blossom. One of the children reached out to touch a petal and looked at me with wonder. I showed her how to cup her hand gently around the stem without harming it. The moment felt delicate and full of meaning. I stood again and watched the morning unfold in soft layers of movement and sound. The laughter that floated across the open space felt like music. The birds sang from the branches overhead, filling the air with a steady rhythm. The breeze carried the scent of freshly turned soil and blooming plants, reminding me of all the days I had worked here when hope felt like something I had to coax out of the ground. As I walked toward the quiet bench near the old oak tree, I felt a calm satisfaction settle in my chest. I sat down and rested my hands in my lap. The world spread out before me in soft strokes of color and motion. It amazed me how much life had returned to this place, how much life had returned to me. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the sun settle against my face. I thought about the loneliness that had once felt heavy enough to break me. I thought about how it had slowly loosened its grip as I found purpose in caring for something outside myself. I thought about the people who now filled my days with connection and the quiet joy of shared moments. I thought about how life can surprise you in gentle ways if you are willing to open yourself to change. A soft breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves in a tender whisper that felt almost like a blessing. I opened my eyes and watched the light dance across the grass. In that moment, I felt something clear and true rise inside me. I had not only rebuilt a park, I had rebuilt myself. The thought settled gently, without grandness, as if it had always been waiting there for me to finally notice. I stood from the bench and looked across the park one more time before turning toward home. My steps felt light and certain, guided by a quiet faith in the life I was still learning to embrace. As I walked back, I felt the whole morning wrap itself around me like a soft promise. I did not know what the next season of my life would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for it. Ready to grow, ready to love, ready to live again with my heart open to whatever came next. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.